I'm not trying to help you, just trying not to have to bury you.
Then we agree.
Rancher buys cabin for 12 cents. But the Apache girl inside wasn't dead. Yet have you ever stood at the edge of a place where no one dared to go, where the very ground seemed to warn you turn back or become part of the silence that morning in Bitter Creek, Montana? The entire town gathered in front of the old courthouse. Winter 1878 had painted the world white, but the cold went deeper than snow. It settled in bones, in hearts, in the spaces between what people knew and what they refused to speak aloud. A cabin and a piece of land, roughly 12 acres, were up for auction. The starting price, 12 cents. The crowd, murmured then, fell silent. No one moved. The well-heeled traders, the wealthy ranch owners, they all stood frozen like statues carved from ice and fear. Only Silas Walker, a rough-around-the-edges rancher with dust-worn clothes and a face carved by too many hard seasons, slowly raised his hand. 12 cents, his hoarse voice rang out. Every head turned, but instead of envy, what filled their eyes was pity, as if the man had just stepped willingly into a trap with no way out. "Do I hear anything higher?" The auctioneer called out, his voice echoing awkwardly across the frozen square. No one answered. The gavel came down. Thud. The cabin now belonged to Silas Walker. On the horseback ride back, Silas could still feel those eyes trailing him like they were whispering a final warning. Do not go there. But Silas had nothing left to lose. A 12-cent cabin with land, a well, and an old barn, just enough to start again, with his scrawny herd of cattle and the ghosts that rode his shoulders from Gettysburg. The dirt road led into sparse woods. Pine trees stood like silent witnesses, their branches heavy with snow. In the distance, the cabin's wooden gate stood quietly among tall grass that had gone yellow and brittle in the cold. Silas pulled the reins, his heart sinking. Hanging at the gate was a body. It was a woman, Apache, by the beadwork on what remained of her torn dress. Her face was smeared with dust and blood. But her eyes were still cracked open, searching for breath in shallow, desperate pulls. Silas tightened his grip on his knife and stepped quickly toward the gate. The 12-cent cabin he had thought was a lucky break was now revealing a secret far more terrifying than any whisper ever told. What would you feel if you were the one to witness such a scene? Drop a 9 inches. The comments, if you've ever made a choice you couldn't take back. And if you want to hear more stories where the West was won not by guns alone but by hearts that refused to break, subscribe. The bright steel knife sliced clean through the rope. The woman's body collapsed, and Silas barely caught her before she hit the frozen ground. She was lighter than he expected. Starvation had hollowed her out, but her weight still carried the density of muscle of someone who had fought and survived. She lay still on the dry grass, breathing in ragged bursts, her chest heaving like it might burst open. Silas tore a strip from his old shirt and wrapped it around the raw, bleeding rope burn on her neck. His hands trembled slightly. He could not tell if it was from the cold or the strangeness of holding a life this close to death in his arms. "Hang on," Silas muttered, his voice rough like gravel under a boot heel. Her dark eyes cracked open, deep and burning with fury and pain. She tried to speak in Apache words he could not understand, but he recognized that look. It was a plea for life, wrapped in the refusal to beg. He reached for the canteen at his hip and dribbled a few drops of water onto her cracked lips. Her throat moved faintly, and her breathing started to steady. Silas crouched beside her, glancing up at the cabin's gate. The rope mark was still etched in the beam. Dried blood smeared across the weathered gray wood, a scene left behind like a warning to anyone foolish enough to step near. He swore under his breath. This 12-cent cabin was no bargain. It was a trap. As the sun dipped low, Silas dragged the woman into the cabin. The little wooden house was thick with dust, its windows boarded shut, but the floor was solid, and cold ashes still lingered in the stove. It did not feel like a place left untouched for 15 years, as the town rumors had claimed. He laid her down on a worn wooden table and pulled a blanket over her shoulders. In silence, Silas studied her face. high cheekbones, a scar along her jawline, hands that bore the calluses of someone who knew how to use a knife. She was Apache, that much was clear. But why would anyone hang her at the gate of this cabin? And who would be cruel enough to leave her there barely alive, like bait in a trap? Silas stepped out onto the porch, squinting into the fading light. Far off at the edge of the woods, he saw a rider on horseback. The man wore a wide-brimmed hat trimmed with silver that caught the last rays of sunlight. He did not approach. He did not ride away. He just stood there watching. When their eyes met, the rider turned sharply and vanished into the trees. A cold shiver ran down Silas's spine. The town had looked at him with pity. This cabin held more than a curse. Someone was watching, waiting, and now he had pulled a living witness down from death's noose. Inside, the woman stirred. Her voice was rough, barely a whisper, but one English word came through danger. Then, softer, "They will come back." Silas clenched his calloused hands. This worn-out rancher had never wanted to be part of someone else's fight. But with a 12-cent cabin and a dying woman now in his care, he knew his days of peace were over. Outside, the wind turned mean. It moved through the pines with a low groan, bending branches that had already lost their patience with winter. Silas stood by the window a long time, listening to it speak in the language of old wood and worry. Then he took his coat and stepped out into the yard. The sky was the color of gunmetal, heavy and waiting. Aiyana followed him, the blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her bare feet left shallow prints in the frost. She didn't ask where he was going. Maybe she already knew. "I'll need wood," Silas said, "and you'll need food." She nodded once. Her throat still showed the rope mark, dark and ugly, but her eyes were awake, now no longer pleading, only watchful. He swung the axe into a stump, splitting pine that groaned, like it remembered the noose, too. Every strike sent sap scent into the air, clean, sharp, almost sweet. Aiyana knelt beside the fire pit and gathered what she could from the half-frozen, ground-dry weeds, pieces of straw, a strip of bark that would catch a spark if treated kindly. They worked in silence, the kind of silence that feels like a conversation neither side wants to end. By noon, smoke rose from the chimney again. The stove hissed alive. Inside, the warmth crawled across the floorboards like a stray dog, deciding whether to trust the hand that fed it. Aiyana stirred a pot with a cracked spoon. The scent of beans and bone broth filled the small room, mixing with the iron tang of old smoke and snow melt. Silas watched her leaning on the doorframe, hat low. "You cook for an army?" he asked. She glanced up, dry as the wind. "For one who eats like one." He half smiled, almost forgetting how. "Fair enough." Her English came slow, deliberate, like someone who had learned the words not from kindness but necessity. But her silence spoke more than words ever could. When she poured him a bowl, he noticed her hands scarred, broad, capable, the kind of hands that had built fires, skinned rabbits, buried kin. When they ate, she didn't sit opposite him. She sat beside the stove, as if still guarding the flame. He wanted to ask about her tribe, about the man named Hartwell, about what the papers might mean, but the look on her face stopped him. Some stories, he understood, had to finish healing before they could be told. After they'd eaten, Silas pushed back his chair and said, "We'll patch the roof before the next snow. You steady the ladder." "I can climb," she said. I don't doubt that he answered, "But you'll steady it anyway." That earned him a faint glare, but she followed. The afternoon light was the color of tarnished brass. They worked above the porch, nailing shingles where the cold wind had pried them loose. Aiyana's hands were clumsy with weakness, but she refused to stop. When her fingers slipped, Silas caught her wrist. She froze, eyes flashing, not fear, but pride, raw and sharp. He let go at once. "I'm not trying to help you," he said, "just trying not to bury you." She looked at him a moment longer, then nodded. "Then we agree." By sunset, the roof held. Their breath came in pale clouds, their shoulders lined with sawdust. When they climbed down, she pointed toward the far ridge. "Smoke," she whispered. Silas followed her gaze. A thin line of gray curled against the horizon, campfire smoke, too steady to be storm fog. "Scouts," he muttered. "Fletcher's men, maybe. They will test the ground," she said. "And the people on it." He set the hammer down slow. "Then they'll find both tougher than they expect." The night came hard and blue. Inside the cabin, the fire glowed low. Silas sat cleaning his rifle, running an oiled rag through the barrel, the habit of a man who'd once lived by rules written in gunmetal. Aiyana mended her torn sleeve by candlelight, each stitch measured. The needle flashed like a small blade. "You fought before," she said without looking up. "Too many times." For what he hesitated, then answered orders. "Maps. Men who never saw the ground they sent us to die on." She tied off the thread and looked at him. "And now I fight, because there's nowhere left to run." Aiyana studied him for a heartbeat, then said softly, "Running is not shame, only not knowing why you run." Silas looked into the fire. "Maybe. But I think I stopped knowing a long time ago." Wind rattled the boards, filling the quiet that followed. Then she spoke again, her voice low. "When they took me, I thought I was the last. My people had gone to the hills. The traders came with rifles. They wanted my grandfather's land, but they wanted something else too. Proof. Hartwell hid it before they killed him. They think I know where." Silas met her eyes. "Do you?" Her gaze dropped to the floor. "No, but I remember his words. He said the truth is buried in the ground, waiting for the right hands to dig." "The ground," Silas repeated. "Always comes back to that." She nodded. "The ground remembers what men forget." Outside, an owl called from the woods, a long, hollow sound that made the night hold its breath. Aiyana drew her blanket tighter. Silas reached for a poker and stirred the coals until sparks climbed the chimney. Then he took off his coat and hung it near her chair. "For the night," he said. "You'll need it more." She hesitated. "And you I've known colder." He stepped out onto the porch. The air was hard enough to chew. Across the field, moonlight turned the snow silver. He lit a cigarette and watched the smoke twist away. His mind wandered to Gettysburg, to faces buried without names, to the sound of rope creaking in cold air. That same sound had followed him all the way here. He dropped the cigarette, ground it under his boot, and went back inside. Aiyana slept lightly, one hand on the knife beneath her blanket. The stove hummed red and alive. Silas sat by the window, rifle across his knees. He told himself he was only keeping watch, but part of him knew watching was just another way of remembering. The next morning, frost clung to the window glass in shapes that looked like feathers. Aiyana was already awake, feeding small twigs into the stove. Her hair was loose black as the ashes she stirred. "I found rabbit tracks," she said. "By the fence. Good eating if we're lucky," he said. She nodded. "You set the snare. I will clean the skins." They worked side by side along the edge of the field. The sun barely showed itself, hiding behind thin clouds like a man too proud to apologize. Aiyana moved quietly, marking loops of twine between bushes. Silas tamped down the snow where her tracks might give them away. Each time their shoulders brushed, he felt the same strange thing, a calm that was almost worse than fear. At midday, they found one rabbit caught fast. She killed it clean with a quick twist, murmured something in Apache under her breath, and pressed her fingers to the ground. "What's that for?" Silas asked. "Thanks," she said. "We take, we thank." He nodded. "Wish the world worked that way more often." "Maybe it does," she said. "Only men forget to listen." They skinned the rabbit by the creek where the ice cracked thin under their boots. Silas's hands were steady, hers precise. When she finished, she handed him the knife handle. "First, you cut like a hunter," she said, "and you talk like one who's seen too much. Then we are the same." He didn't argue. Some truths didn't need words. By afternoon, the wind had softened. They carried the meat back to the cabin. On the way, Aiyana stopped suddenly. "Listen." At first he heard nothing but their breathing. Then faint but clear the sound of a horse's snort far off, muffled by distance. He raised his rifle, scanning the trees. Nothing. When he lowered it, her eyes were still fixed on the horizon. "They watch," she said. "Always watch." That night, they hung the meat above the stove to dry. Aiyana showed him how to rub ash into the cuts to keep flies away when spring came. He didn't ask where she'd learned it. He only watched her hands, strong, certain, the hands of someone who had built her own survival from scraps. Later, they sat in the dim glow, too tired to talk. The quiet between them had grown familiar, almost gentle. Silas poured a small cup of whiskey and pushed it toward her. She shook her head. "I need clear eyes." He drank for both of them. "To clear skies, then," he said, and the joke sat between them like a half-broken smile. Before turning in, she stepped to the door and pressed her palm against the frame, whispering a word he didn't catch. When she saw him watching, she said, "So the wood knows we will come back. Expecting to leave always," she said. "Only fools believe they belong anywhere." He almost told her he used to be one of those fools. Instead, he nodded, blew out the lamp, and let the dark fold around them. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of cold and work. Morning light, firewood, repair food. Each day the cabin changed a little boards, straightened nails, tightened the roof, stopped leaking smoke. Even the air seemed to thicken with something alive again. Once Silas caught her humming while she cleaned a rabbit pelt. The tune was soft, rising and falling like the sway of tall grass in wind. He didn't interrupt. He just listened the sound, carrying him somewhere far from the ache of his old wars. In turn, she caught him polishing his father's pocket watch, though it hadn't ticked in years. "Why keep it?" she asked. He turned it over in his hand. "To remember the man I was before the noise started." She considered that. Then, "Keep it close. Noise returns." He smiled faintly. "You talk like a prophet." "No," she said. "Like someone who's been burned and still carries the smoke." That evening a snowstorm came, fast wind, howling snow like handfuls of salt thrown from heaven. They secured the shutters and sat close to the stove. The fire painted their faces in red and gold. Outside, the world disappeared into white. "You ever think about leaving this land?" he asked. She stared into the flame. "The land does not belong to us. We belong to it." Hard to belong to something that keeps trying to kill you. Maybe that is how it tests love. He didn't know what to say to that. So he poured coffee and handed her a tin cup. She took it without looking, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. The contact was small, almost accidental, but it stayed with him long after. The storm lasted 3 days. When it finally broke, the world gleamed clean, all tracks erased. Silas shoveled a path to the barn breath, fogging muscles stiff. Inside, he found the horse restless, snorting toward the woods. He rubbed its neck until it calmed. Then he saw them, footprints faint but fresh, circling the cabin before vanishing toward the trees. He returned inside, snow still clinging to his boots. "We've had visitors." Aiyana looked up sharply. "How many? 2? Maybe 3. She went to the window slit, peered out into the white. "They wait. They want you afraid." He set his rifle on the table. "They'll have to work harder." That night, neither of them slept. They took turns at the window, trading the watch without words. At one point, Aiyana began to hum again, the same low tune, but slower, almost mournful. When she stopped, he said quietly, "What's it mean?" She hesitated. "It is a song for those who are lost but not gone." He nodded, staring into the dark. "Seems I've met a few of those." Before dawn, she spoke again. "When I was a child, my mother said the sky keeps every sound. One day it will give them back." Silas thought of all the shots he'd fired, all the names he'd forgotten. Then the sky must be heavy. "Yes," she said, "but not as heavy as a man's heart." On the 4th morning, the world was still. No wind, no tracks. The silence pressed on their ears. Aiyana stepped outside, first scanning the tree line. Then she crouched by the gate, the same beam where the rope had hung. From the folds of her blanket she drew a charred stick and began to draw on the wood, slow and deliberate. "What are you doing?" Silas asked. "Making a mark," she said, "so my people know I live." He stepped closer. The symbol was simple, a crooked line crossing a circle. Smoke and path. Life continuing. She brushed ash over it, with her palms sealing it in. "If they see this, they will come." "You sure you want them to?" "I want truth," she said. "And truth does not come alone." She turned toward him. "You could still leave. Ride south. Forget this place." He shook his head. Tried forgetting before. Never took. For the first time her face softened. "Then maybe you are meant to remember." She reached out and touched the sleeve of his coat, barely a second, just enough to say what words couldn't. "Thank you," she said, For the roof, the fire, the not asking too much. He nodded once. For the company, then. When she smiled, it was quick and rare, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds only to hide again. They stood there a while, side by side, watching the sky bruise toward evening. Somewhere, far beyond the hills, faint and distant, came the echo of a horn, long, low, uncertain. Aiyana lifted her head. You hear that he did. And though he couldn't name it, something in the sound made his stomach turn cold. He looked toward the dark ridge where the smoke had risen days ago. They're close, he said. Yes, she whispered. The storm is coming. She turned back toward the cabin, her blanket trailing across the snow. Silas followed his shadow long beside hers. The wind rose again, carrying with it the smell of pine and distant fire. Inside, he checked the rifle, cleaned the chamber, and laid cartridges in a neat row across the table. Aiyana stacked wood by the stove, her movements steady, deliberate. When she finished, she placed her hand on the doorframe again, whispering that same quiet word. What's it mean? He asked. It means we are still here, she said. Outside, the last light of the day fell across the fence, the yard the beam marked with her ash symbol. The snow reflected it all back silver and cold. Somewhere in the distance a crow called, once sharp as a crack in glass. Silas looked at her, at the firelight on her face. Tomorrow, he said. She met his gaze. Tomorrow. They said nothing more. The world beyond the cabin waited, silent, hungry, and wide. Inside, the fire kept its small promise burning steady through the night. That night, Silas barely slept. Inside the small cabin, the flickering firelight from the wood stove danced across cracked wooden walls. The Apache woman lay wrapped in blankets, occasionally groaning, her eyes fluttering open, then slipping shut again. Silas sat beside her, his Winchester rifle within reach. He had grown used to prairie wolves, cattle thieves, and countless lonely nights beneath the stars. But now a different kind of unease throbbed behind his temples. Who in their right mind would hang a woman at the gate like some sick spectacle? And why had the whole town stayed silent? As dawn broke, Silas knew he had to ride into town. The woman needed medicine, clean water, and fresh bandages. He left her inside, locked the door, and took the dirt path back to Bitter Creek. When he stepped into the general store, a strange tension hung in the air. Conversation stopped. A few women pretended to browse fabric, but their eyes kept darting toward him. Silas walked straight to the counter and pulled a few coins from his pocket. I need bandages, antiseptic, and some food. The storekeeper, a wiry man with trembling hands, quietly packed the supplies without a word. He set the bag on the counter and, with a whisper barely above a breath, asked the cabin. At Crow's Gate, Silas gave a slow nod. The entire store seemed to hold its breath. An old woman dropped her sewing basket. Spools of thread rolled across the wooden floor. Just then the back door swung open. A tall man stepped in, his wide-brimmed hat rimmed with silver catching the light. It was him the rider Silas had seen watching from the forest's edge. His gaze was sharp as a blade, his calloused hand resting near the grip of his gun. Fletcher Knox, he introduced himself, voice smooth as polished wood. Heard you made an interesting little purchase. Silas said nothing. Fletcher dropped a leather pouch onto the counter. It landed with a heavy thud, the unmistakable clink of metal inside. $500. That's thousands more than what you paid. Hand the cabin over to me tonight. The store went still. The shopkeeper flinched, dropping a glass jar of preserves. It shattered across the floor. Everyone in that room knew what that cabin was. And now they were waiting to hear what Silas would say. Silas's hand tightened on the saddle strap slung over his shoulder. His steely eyes locked on Fletcher. $500 for a rotting shack. You must be buying something else. Fletcher smiled, but it was a smile cold as forged steel. I'm buying your good sense. That cabin is not for a man who wants to live long. In that moment, Silas could hear the fearful murmurs around him. Fletcher's words were not just a warning. They were a death sentence, spoken plain and direct to his face. By the time Silas returned to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the distant mountain range. He carried a heavy sack in one hand, Fletcher Knox's cold warning still echoing in his mind. His horse let out a soft snort as they approached the gate, the same gate where a body had hung just the day before. Silas glanced up. The rope had been cut, but the dried blood still stained the wood. Inside, the flicker of the stove's fire cast golden shadows across the cabin's wooden walls. The Apache woman was awake. She sat leaning against the wall, her deep black eyes fixed on Silas. In the firelight, her features came into full view. Warrior shoulders, long arms laced with bruises and scars, a fierce blend of raw beauty and brutal survival. "You saved me," she said, her English broken but clear. Silas set the bag down and poured her a cup of water. "I just couldn't stand to see a human being treated like an animal." She drank slowly, each sip deliberate. Then she spoke again, her words slicing the air like a blade. "I am Aiyana, granddaughter of White Hawk Chief of the Apache. They captured me to force our tribe to give up our land." She paused, her hand touching the burned skin at her throat. "This cabin is a message." Silas frowned. "A message?" She nodded, her gaze drifting to the floorboards beneath them. "They hung me at the gate to make a point. This cabin used to belong to a white man named Samuel Hartwell. He found something, proof that traders and judges had stolen our ground. He hid the evidence here, and they killed him for it." Silas felt the weight of her words settle in his chest like ash. "And those papers, they might still be here." Aiyana's eyes met his. "I do not know, but they believe so. And me, I was just a hostage meant to keep the tribe silent." Outside, the wind howled through the rotting boards. In the distance, Silas heard the faint sound of hammering, someone setting up camp nearby. He peered through the narrow window slit and spotted shadows of horses moving through the darkness. Fletcher had not been bluffing. He had sent men to watch. Silas turned back. His eyes met hers. In those deep black eyes the fire had returned. Not the hopeless flicker of a dying soul, but the blaze of warrior blood refusing to be extinguished. "You saved me," Aiyana said, her voice stronger now. "So now you must fight with me. If not, we will both end up hanging at that gate." Silas clenched his jaw, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his rifle. He was just a weary rancher looking for a quiet place to settle. But now this 12-cent cabin had become a gateway into a storm of blood and fire. "Thank you for being here. If this story stirred something in you, memories of old days, dusty evenings, the echo of hooves pounding in your chest, go ahead and subscribe to my channel so that every day we can sit together again, and I will tell you another story from the West." Night fell fast like a velvet curtain drawn tight across the prairie. Silas sat by the window, his Winchester laid across his knees, eyes fixed on the blackness beyond the gate. The fire in the stove had died down, leaving only faint embers casting Aiyana's shadow across the cracked wooden wall. She was sitting up fully now, her eyes glowing in the dark like embers refusing to die. From the distance came the sound of hooves, heavy, slow, and rhythmic like a funeral drum. Silas squinted. Silhouettes lined the hilltop. Torches burned bright, and the wind carried the raspy laughter of men. Then a voice rang out cold as a blade. "Silas Walker, come out and talk like a man." "That cabin ain't yours." Fletcher Knox stepped from the shadows, his silver-rimmed hat gleaming in the firelight. Behind him stood nearly a dozen riders, guns slung at their hips, eyes gleaming like predators on the hunt. Silas opened the door and stepped onto the porch. He did not hide his rifle, but he held it firm, his stare icy. "Bit late for a tea visit, ain't it, Fletcher?" Let out a dry chuckle, his voice echoing across the clearing. "I offered you 500 for that cabin. That offer's gone. What we need is inside that house. Hand it over, and you still walk away breathing." Aiyana appeared behind Silas, wrapped in an old blanket but standing tall and unyielding. The men on horseback flinched, the image of a woman once hanged at the gate, now standing proud on the porch, like a curse risen from the grave. "You tried to kill me," her voice came rough but powerful, "because I know the truth. But my blood won't buy you peace." Fletcher narrowed his eyes, his hand halfway to his pistol, then lowered it slowly. "Tough girl. But you see, Walker, you're holding on to a wounded wolf. She's dragging you into a bloodbath. Let her go. Step aside and keep your life." Silas turned to look at Aiyana. In that moment he saw something in her eyes, not fear, but belief. A lone rancher and an Apache warrior, two misfits standing against a pack of wolves. He spat in the dirt. "I paid for this cabin. It's mine, and anyone who lays a hand on this woman will pay in blood." Silence stretched tight like a drawn bowstring. Then the cold clatter of metal. Fletcher raised his hand, signaling his men. Rifles slid from holsters, catching torchlight. Silas stepped back and pulled Aiyana inside. His voice dropped low. "Take that revolver. Tonight, we fight." Outside, hoofbeats thundered louder. The field around the cabin lit up in flames. The storm had arrived. The heavy pounding on the wooden door sounded like a coffin being nailed shut. Then came the first hail of bullets, screaming through the air, tearing holes through the cabin walls. Splinters flew like sparks. Silas tackled Aiyana to the floor, and his Winchester roared back, blasting one of the attackers off the fence line. Gunsmoke thickened the small cabin like fog. Every time Silas fired, he heard the curses and snarls of men outside. They were not holding back. They meant to drown the cabin in blood. Aiyana, though still weak, clutched the Colt he had handed her. Her large hands trembled but held firm. Her fingers squeezed the trigger. Bang! Another man dropped at the gate, his body falling exactly where she herself had once hung. The cabin gate had now become a boundary marked in blood. "There's too many of them," Silas growled, sweat and powder dust streaking his brow. He flipped a wooden table on its side as a barricade, slamming more rounds into his Winchester. Outside, Fletcher's voice bellowed, "Burn it! Burn the cabin, and burn them with it." A torch sailed onto the dry straw roof. Flames burst into the sky, golden light, flickering in Aiyana's black eyes. She gritted her teeth, braced her hands, and stood tall, her frame casting a shadow over Silas. "They will not have this cabin," she said, her voice clear and resolute. "And they will not have me." Just then, from far across the prairie, a war horn blew low and deep like thunder rolling through the hills. And then beneath the moonlight came the silhouettes hundreds of Apache riders. White Hawk's tribe. They formed a wall of horse and steel, their spears flashing war cries ripping through the night. Aiyana had marked the cabin wall days ago with a symbol in ash, a call for help that Silas had not understood. But her people had. Fletcher's men panicked. Some glanced back, terror on their faces, as the full force of the tribe stormed forward like a desert sandstorm. Fletcher cursed and drew his revolver, kicking his horse and charging toward the cabin, desperate to finish it before everything fell apart. But Silas was already waiting. He stepped out onto the porch. His Winchester fired the bullet whistling past Fletcher's silver hat, nearly knocking him from the saddle. Aiyana stood beside him, a wall of muscle and fury, and shouted in the Apache tongue. Her call was answered by a thunder of voices as the warriors closed around the cabin. A flaming arrow streaked through the air, striking a torch in one of the mercenaries' hands. It exploded into flame. Fire swallowed the fence line. Apache horses surged in, completing the circle. Fletcher yanked his reins to flee, but it was too late. The native riders moved in like blades of steel, swallowing his entire hired gang. Silas stood on the burning porch, sweat and ash covering his face. Beside him, Aiyana stood like a mountain shadow, her eyes blazing. They had survived the night. But Silas knew this was only the beginning. The cabin's secret was still buried, and whoever was pulling Fletcher's strings would be far more dangerous. Dawn painted the prairie blood red. Smoke still curled from the roof of the cabin, but the fire had been put out by buckets of water brought by the Apache tribe. The bodies of horses and fallen men lay scattered around the fence line, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and scorched ash. Silas sat slumped on the porch steps, breathing heavy, his calloused hands still trembling from the blood-soaked night. In front of him stood Chief White Hawk, long, silver hair, flowing eyes, old but burning bright. He wrapped his arms around Aiyana, and the warrior woman bowed her head, her powerful arms clinging to her grandfather. Tears mixed with soot and sweat as they streamed down her sun-darkened cheeks. "My granddaughter lives," White Hawk said, his voice a low thunder. He looked Silas in the eye. "But the enemy will return. This cabin hides something they want buried forever." Silas turned his gaze to the scorched house. He remembered what Aiyana had told him, that Samuel Hartwell had hidden the real documents. He stepped inside, and knelt on the smoke-stained floor. In the center of the room, he spotted something odd, a square patch of planks, sealed tightly with black stone-hard resin. "Here," Silas whispered. Whitehawk nodded and signaled. Two warriors stepped forward with axes. Heavy strikes echoed through the cabin, cracking the resin, splitting the wood. At last, the floorboards gave way, revealing a dark hollow beneath. Silas reached in and pulled out a dusty iron chest and a rolled leather map. When the lid creaked open, every eye locked on it. Inside were scrolls, land deeds, and government seals. Each paper bore a familiar signature, Judge William Crane, and beside it, a bold red stamp, Governor Marcus Webb. Aiyana clenched her jaw. They used forged documents. Sold our tribe's land to 10-20 different buyers. Hartwell found out. He tried to expose them, and they killed him. Silas flipped through more papers, payment ledgers, names of those who had taken bribes. Judges, sheriffs, even prominent ranch owners. The sums were massive, tens of thousands of dollars. But it was the map that made Silas's blood run cold. Drawn in careful ink was the location of a silver mine right beneath Apache sacred ground. "Now you understand," Whitehawk said quietly. "Fletcher was just a hound. The masterminds are Crane and Webb. They will not stop. They will send soldiers. They will burn this place down and kill anyone who knows." Silas clenched his fists. His 12-cent cabin had turned out to be a graveyard of secrets and a spark that could set fire to an entire rotten empire. He looked at Aiyana, still shaking but proud. Then to Whitehawk, his old eyes heavy with the sorrow of a stolen people. "They wanted to silence you, Silas," said voice hard as stone. "But now I know the truth too, and I swear this cabin will never be a grave again." That afternoon, the prairie wind rose fierce and wild. Dark clouds gathered overhead, heralding a coming storm. Silas tightened the saddle straps, Winchester slung over his shoulder, while Aiyana and the Apache warriors set up a defensive perimeter around the cabin. Everyone knew the forces of Crane and Webb could arrive at any moment. The sound of hooves thundered from the distance, loud, relentless, like rolling drums. Hundreds of riders appeared on the horizon, cloaks billowing, rifles glinting. At the front rode Judge William Crane, face hard, as stone, flanked by Governor Webb's soldiers. They stopped at the cabin gate, the same place where Aiyana's body had once hung. Crane called out, his voice booming, hand over the iron chest. "And that Apache girl, and we'll spare your life, Walker. You're just a poor cowhand. Don't let 12 cents become your tomb." Silas stepped out onto the porch, eyes steady. He raised the stack of papers pulled from the chest. "These documents are enough to hang both you and your governor." "You think I'll bow down?" murmurs rippled through the crowd of riders. Some began to shift uneasily at the mention of Webb. They too knew betrayal might soon turn on them. Crane snarled and shouted the order to attack. Gunfire erupted. Bullets ripped through the air. The Apache responded with a storm of arrows and battle cries that shook the earth. The fight exploded right at the cabin's gate. Silas dropped the first attacker, then turned to fell the second. Aiyana stood tall at the entrance, her powerful arms wielding the Colt with thunderous force, each shot like a crack of lightning. The fire of battle raged. Webb's riders faltered against the fierce coordination of Silas and the tribe. Confusion spread, and many fled, leaving Crane alone. Still defiant, he charged toward the cabin, gun raised at Silas. But Aiyana was already there, blocking the gate. Her massive hand swung up, knocking the pistol clean from Crane's grip. He collapsed in the dirt, eyes wide as he stared at the papers in Silas's hand. "Justice comes," Silas growled, his Winchester aimed squarely at Crane's chest, "no matter how many cabins you burn." Crane was bound and handed over to the warriors. The evidence from the iron chest was delivered by Whitehawk and Silas directly to the territorial marshal in Helena. 1 week later, Governor Webb and his accomplices were marched out in handcuffs before the public. News spread like wildfire. All 3 counties trembled. The 12-cent cabin was no longer a place of hanging, but a symbol of justice. Aiyana, the chief's granddaughter, was hailed as the one who returned from the dead. And Silas Walker, the once forgotten rancher, became a hero not just for his steady aim, but because he had chosen to stand on the side of truth. Years later, when the prairie wind whispered through the grasslands, one could still see a dim light glowing inside the cabin. But Silas was not there. He had returned the cabin to White Hawk's tribe, who used it as a meeting house, a place where Apache elders gathered to teach the young about the fight for their land. On the final day before he left, Aiyana stood with Silas at the gate. She held out her hand,